Today's lecture covers the NSDA public forum topic. In the United States, social media is beneficial for democratic values. This is a very controversial topic, as the quote on the top left notes that a lot of research has been done on this question in the last couple of years, and as the quote from the Washington Post points out that, there are many kind of intuitive sides to this. 5 or 6 years ago, maybe a bit longer, we had the Arab Spring where we saw the internet and, just the emergence of the original social media, Twitter, kind of empowering people to challenge authoritarian governments. Now we see social media being used in, a potentially anti-democratic way, depending on your perspective, to lead to kind of maybe a overthrow of a popularly elected government in the United States to protect an existing president from what many, or at least some, saw as electoral fraud, and to prevent a change in power. So we have vivid examples in the world where social media is definitely influencing democracy. Now, what is social media? We have a general kind of sense, a general gut sense as to what social media is. Generally, it's a couple things. One is that it's user-created content, right? Users meaning anyone who wishes to publish on this platform, wishes to make a statement, anything like that is generating content. So if you're posting on Facebook, if you're posting on TikTok, if you're posting on Twitter, that is all social media. Second of all, it's distributed content. It's content that's kind of pushed at you, right? You might go to the Washington Post website to find an article, on the social media topic that you would like to use. Distributed content is content that's pushed at you because you are on a particular platform. This does include bots. Bots are automated social media accounts. So that's one question I had when I started the research. Well, is a bot included? Because automated social media account, right? That's definitely designed kind of to influence people directly, but not like human to human influence, right? It's kind of, at least, there's a human that created the bot, but there's certainly some areas in between, and bots themselves are particularly controversial. But as this definition makes clear, it does include that. I think there is an interesting question of, like, does it include the social media companies themselves? So, in other words, if someone says Twitter is bad because it excludes Trump's voice, right? Trump was banned from Twitter. Can the pro argue that that's the social media companies, not the social media itself, right? And you've seen a lot of debate recently. It's kind of been around for a while, but it's been a little more popularized, I think almost ironically, by kind of your extreme political conservatives, Ted Cruz, Josh Hawley, some others, who are saying, hey, these companies, right, that own the social media platforms like Twitter that kicked off Trump, and Facebook that at least have kind of temporarily suspended Trump, have too much power. But is that really the companies using their platforms to control things, right? That's not user-generated content. That's restricting user-generated content. So I think that's an important question to think about that I don't even really have a strong opinion on one way or the other, but I think could come up in the debates either directly or indirectly. One important thing to understand is that social media companies, they are considered hosts under the law and not publishers. So if you publish something, and you have a lot of leeway as a publisher, especially in the political realm, but if you publish something that's just completely false and damaging, you can be held liable for that. You can be sued. So we see lawsuits now where media companies like, Fox News and Newsmax, continue to kind of publish these stories that says the Old Dominion voting systems that are used frequently in the election, that these actually kind of rigged the election in favor of Biden, that they were influenced and controlled by Venezuela. Most people kind of consider this just to be completely false and like made up, and this obviously damaged the brand of the Old Dominion voting system. So they have lawsuits right now against Newsmax and Fox. We don't know that they'll win those lawsuits, but at the very least, they are reasonable lawsuits. You can't just make something up and damage other people and damage other companies as a news provider. Now, if somebody posts something on social media, that's different, right? So if somebody attacks the Old Dominion, voting systems on social media, if I post something criticizing the Old Dominion's voting systems on social media, on Facebook, Facebook is not liable for that. Neither is Twitter, because they're a host of the information and not publishers. So there's actually a controversy where you could actually, within this controversy, you can find some evidence on the pros and the cons of social media, about whether or not these companies should actually be considered publishers and they're responsible for all their content. That's obviously difficult, right? For them to be responsible for anything that their millions of users, there's millions of users post. So, but that's just something you should be aware of as you approach this topic. Okay, now moving into the next definitions, democracy. We'll look at democracy and democratic values. What is democracy? Well, there's a couple ways to look at it, and it includes a couple elements. One is it includes popular elections, right? Just the idea of there being an election, some type of elections. There's different kind of democratic systems, right? But the idea generally is that there is some sort of election to choose the leader or leadership. The second is, of course, you have a representative government, right? We don't vote on every single policy. We don't have a referendum on every policy the government enacts. We have representatives who, once we choose them, kind of make decisions about policy, right? So it's important to understand everything's not a direct democracy. There's kind of this layer of mediation. Some of it comes from the idea that we don't want the public, the uneducated public, making every single decision, but that's important to understand. Now, then you can say, well, what is required, something to think about for a democracy to function well? Well, we want to have a properly informed citizenry, right, who's reasonably well educated. You can debate how well educated they need to be, right? But, even originally when the Constitution was formed, most people did not even finish what would be the equivalent of high school. A lot of people were illiterate, right? But the idea was that you at least move to a higher level of education. The second is that there's a quality means of deliberation. Well, what does a quality means of deliberation mean? Well, we might have an example of, for example, Habermas's ideal speech situation. That's where everybody is kind of treated equally. Everyone's equally respected. Everybody has an equal opportunity to speak. Again, it's an ideal speech situation. We understand that does not ordinarily happen. There are all types of power relationships, right, that are impacted by race, class, gender, socioeconomic status, right? Everyone doesn't always have the chance to speak for the same amount of time, right? Politicians argue about this endlessly before they have, a presidential debate, for example, right? So this can kind of go on and on and on, right? But the idea is that we want to move in this direction. So one question that can kind of arise is, well, does social media make the speech situation better, or does it make it worse? And of course, we also kind of need a functional society. Well, what do we mean by that? It means that society has to kind of function properly, right? We can't have just kind of a lot of instability in society, a lot of chaos, a lot of factionalism. Democracy is not going to work well in that world either, right? And there are definitely debates. You've probably seen articles just popping up about, hey, is our society continuing to function well? Now, I also want to kind of talk about the values of democracy, and I'm going to talk about this even more a little bit on the next slide when we think about the resolution. But the values of democracy, right, we can kind of say, there's some kind of core ones that we're used to, that, each person gets a say, each person gets a vote. We want to have basic idea of equality. If everybody's going to participate, they should kind of participate equally, and we should have fair treatment of minorities. Now, there are a lot of other ones, right, where we can say that they include democratic decision making. We make decisions by including everyone. We have free speech, equality before the law, justice. The one thing I'm going to kind of point out here, and you can see this link to some of these other ones articulated on the right. And if you go to the slideshow itself and you click on the link, right, there's life, liberty, pursuit of happiness, justice, common good, equality, truth, diversity, popular sovereignty. That just kind of means that people rule, patriotism. The idea of the values of democracy is a much broader concept than democracy itself, right? So, for example, we could say is something good for debate, right? So you have debate. You're familiar with what debate is. We say is something good for the values of debate. That's much broader. Like, what are the values of debate, right? You could say, well, values of debate are like a value of debate is the free flow of information, the free exchange of ideas. A value of debate is that students develop critical thinking skills. A value of debate is that people get to speak. A value of debate is that people expand their vocabulary and like their association with ideas, right? So those values of debate are more than what debate is, right? And are arguably even kind of a bit distinct, like critical thinking. Think about it, right? Like critical thinking it occurs in places other than debate, and it's a broader value. So if I say it's almost like the values of debate, right? It's just kind of a reference. It's kind of a way. It's a container. Maybe I'll say it that way. It's a container for a whole pile of ideas, right? And the values of democracy is a container expression, right, for a whole set of ideas. So it seems like we could have a debate. We'd say one of the values of democracy, for example, right, is truth. Regardless of whether or not social media increases or decreases democracy, right? Does social media promote truth? If it doesn't promote truth, then it's not supporting one of the values of democracy, even if it might support democracy in some ways. Do you understand that? So it's going to take a little bit of unpacking. It's something I hadn't really thought about until I really looked at the resolution and really even started preparing this presentation well after I had done some research on it. But I think it's something that could come up in your debates. It's something that's going to need a bit of explanation, but it's something that's really important. I think the resolution is arguably referring to these values even more than it's just referring to the ideas of democracy. So some notes on the resolution. The first is that the resolution doesn't say on balance. So I think some pro teams will kind of try to make a framework argument that, hey, this has any value to democracy or any positive impact on democratic values, then we could win the debate, even if the cons shows some negative. Now, I don't think that's a good framework, right? Because it would really rig the debate in favor of the pro, right? As long as they identified some way that social media enhances democracy, then they would win the debate, which would kind of be too easy. I think you could definitely, like, there are definitely some reasons that enhances democracy. I think there's a debate about whether it on balance enhances democracy that you could argue for, but not the other way around. The second is, as noted, the topic is about more, and this is covered in points 2 and 3 here. The topic isn't just about social media, but what the democratic values are, right? Okay, I just talked about that in depth, but I think it is very important. Fourth, there aren't like a lot of stats on the impact of democracy. So, public forum debaters love statistics, right? But you're not going to find articles that says social media has increased or decreased democracy by like 3.14%. Like, that's just not going to exist. I say that kind of strongly. I suppose it's possible that you could find one article that makes such a claim, but democracy is something that's kind of, it's hard in and of itself to measure, and then to say something impacts what, that thing that really kind of eludes measurement, right? Like a broad thing by social media, like by a certain percentage, is like incredibly, I'll say it this way, incredibly unlikely. You can find studies that say like, oh, like we think social media is like undermined equality by like this certain percentage, but even those are kind of hard to find. It's usually more about like polarization or conflict. But regardless, statistics on this topic are going to be really hard to find. And at best, are going to kind of be indirect, right? You could say like, oh, social media increased polarization by like 3.4%. You could say like polarization like undermines democracy or something like that, right? But this really is noted in number 5. This is more of a values topic, right? It says values like right in the resolution, right? But it's not something that PF debaters are used to debating, because I always say stats and PF are like nuclear war and like policy debate, all right? That everybody wants like a quantification, a 2.4%, a 1.8% from some different like random studies that have been conducted, right? So, if you debated Medicare for all, you could say that would increase access by like X percent, like save so many lives, hurt the economy by like Y percent, So, we saw West Africa urbanization, the IMF, they're all kind of statistics on the impacts of these things. But it's going to be something that the PF debaters are not used to debating, which is values. And values are hard to weigh, right? What if the pro wins that this increases like free speech expression, right? And the con wins it like hurts equality. Well, then we got to like weigh those two together, weigh those two against each other. Like which one is more important? That's the type of weighing that PF debaters are not used to doing. It's hard in general, right? Even in other forms of debate, they kind of end up favoring consequences a little bit, not as much as they do in PF. But values are hard to weigh, both as impacts and compare, right? So if you even just take the traditional public forum weighing mechanisms, right? Magnitude, scope, probability, right? Like how do those really fit into values? It's different. It's difficult. Also, values can contradict, right? Even a perfect process, right? What if it's a really good democratic process? Say social media enhances the democratic process. It enhances free expression. Say elections kind of are fair. Well, we could end up with the majority in power suppressing minority rights, right? Minority rights is kind of a democratic value. But what happens is that the majority restricts the minority, right? So it says in this last tendency, this call to legislate fake news when the two pillars of liberal democracy, elections and the orderly transition of power, and the constitutionality of guaranteed freedom of expression increasingly come into conflict, right? So these values are going to contradict. Some of these values in this debate are going to, they're in tension, they're in contradiction themselves, right? Even before we get to the impact of social media, right? You could say free expression can be in conflict with equality, right? Like, and there's debates about this all the time, right? Like, okay, is racist speech, right? Should we allow racist speech? That obviously is like kind of consistent with freedom of expression. It's very damaging for equality. All right, so the democratic values, some of them inherently are at least in tension with one another. We can go say, in some instances they contradict, maybe not at all, but there are democratic values that are just kind of in tension with one another. And you're going to be able to you're going to have to, in order to win the debate, talk about why one of those values is more important than the other. All right, a couple notes on the judges. Older judges are less inclined to believe that social media is good. Younger judges are kind of less likely, honestly, to question it, right? Like kids are on TikTok all the time. They used to be on like Snapchat. They're probably still there like a little bit on the Snapchat. They're always accessing social media. And even people using it, even adults, like, so they're just kind of like roll with it. Like it's just part of their lives. Now, it doesn't mean maybe once they research it and think about it, or maybe, they even recognize there are some problems with it, but they kind of continue to carry on. Adults, they love their Twitter, but they recognize limitations. And, a recent poll that came out just the other day here in mid-May says that, a poll says 64% of Americans believe social media does more harm than good. 3 in 4 Republicans said they believe social media divides the country. It's interesting if you think about it, right? If it wasn't for social media, it'd be very difficult, probably would not have been possible for Trump to become the president, right? You probably would not have an insurrection on January 6th without social media, right? So, but even 54% of Democrats think it's bad. So statistically speaking, right, in debate tournaments, a little bit different in a way. You do obviously have some younger judges, right? You have some college students. The debate community is a little more liberal, so you're more likely to have Democrats. But I think a majority of your judges' approach to debate are going to kind of, in their heads, kind of think con. Now, of course, judges are supposed to be fair and evaluate all the arguments, but that kind of, at the very least, maybe we'll call it an implicit, somewhere on the continuum to an implicit to an explicit bias, is going to be a little bit in favor of the con. And it's something that the pro, you have to really kind of debate well to like overcome that bias. I think if it's super close, judges are more likely, it's kind of hard to ignore your gut on certain on certain issues. Now let's look at the pro and the con arguments. In terms of the pro arguments, participation could increase, right? Participation, getting more people involved in democracy is obviously a democratic value. In democracy, we want everybody to participate. Social media makes it easy to participate, at least to kind of share your view, right? A lot of people had views. Maybe they told a couple of their friends, but they didn't really kind of go out and spread the ideas around. Here, of course, on social media, they are largely spreading it to their friends, a wider group of friends than it used to be, but they are kind of participating in politics. It also enables more like-minded people to be connected, especially across geographic boundaries, right? So it's like, okay, I start to see that there are some people who live in Illinois or live in Arizona who share my views that I never would have really kind of had the opportunity to connect with. So maybe, now there's a group of those people who become involved in certain things. That group participation, it kind of makes it easier to form a larger group. Larger groups can have more impact. It's consistent with the idea of liberty, right? Like I should be able to say, goes a little bit with free speech here too, but just the idea of personal liberty, I should be able to say what I think and publish it where I want. There is definitely deliberation and debate, right? Kind of goes a little bit with the participation, right? But people can easily post, people debate. We see it on social media all the time. It's what originally social media was not for. It was more just meant to be social, right? To connect your friends and those types of things. But this is easy for deliberation and debate. It could be patriotic, depending on how you define it, right? There's obviously, people kind of display a love for country on social media. We have the notion of popular sovereignty, right? If democracy comes from the people, and that is really where democracy should come from, right? Then that's really the only thing we have, right? Like, we can appeal to God, we can appeal to other values, but in the end, governments really have to have to a degree the support of the people. In the United States and other countries, they're selected by the people, and this is kind of a way, as we just talked about, for people to participate and express themselves. Maybe it's consistent with the pursuit of happiness. Some people love being on social media and posting. Right, we have the free speech argument, which kind of goes with liberty that I was talking about earlier. It may be easier with these groups to form these common groups to form social movements to connect, right? I mean, we certainly, whether you think it was good or bad, we basically had an insurrection on January 6th. Excuse me. Social media made it possible for all those people who came from all different parts of the country who shared these extreme views to kind of connect with one another, right? So that's an instance where we can see most people, think that was bad, but you could think about other things, environmental movements, there's movements for racial equality, like Black Lives Matter, these common protests. People can come together on social media, they organize, they get in these groups, and they go and they protest. The other value of social media is, of course, you sometimes come across views that are different from your own. It's hard to move the needle, right, on getting people from one view to another, but people do change their views, right? Like we had Trump win an election in swing states in 2016, right? In 2016 and 2020, right? We have Joe Biden winning the election with a different set of values. Now, things are different effects like turnout, who voted, those types of things, but there are definitely people who change their mind, and they may have changed their mind for reasons other than social media. Might have just been what they saw on the news. That's where most people get their information, or at least used to get their information. But social media does have an effect, right? There are people whose minds change. I've seen some evidence that says it reduces negative advertising. I don't think this is a great argument in and of itself, but the idea is that you don't run these broad-based negative ads. You kind of target people particularly, and kind of spin the ad in a positive way to get them to accept your point of view. There's evidence that it boosts voter turnout and participation, which makes sense, right? People are participating online. People have ideas. They post their own ideas. They become more invested in their own ideas. Maybe they are really upset with something a Republican is posting, on the other side, or support for Trump. So they're motivated to go out and vote. We had really high voter turnout in the last election and the last presidential election here. It'll be interesting to see whether or not that sustains. We can target advertising that most effectively engages voters, right? Like you had broadcast media, right, which is like your television networks, right? They're reaching millions of people with the same ad, right? They're kind of like, well, these, there's groups of people that generally kind of think this type of thing, so we'll target an ad at them. So all social media marketing, they get to learn a lot about you, right? Your age, your income, right? Who your friends are, obviously, because you're connected to all these other people, what posts you're liking, people participate in those little games that they like to play, which actually reveal a lot of individual information about themselves. Okay. And then they can target ads that are very specific to you and your other beliefs, and then argue that, they essentially argue that these other beliefs you have are consistent with their candidate. It is also a way to distribute important information, right? Said people learn mostly from the news. Now they can learn from other ways. They see other things come up in their feed. We need an informed citizenry in order to have a strong democracy. Now, as we'll see in the con arguments, maybe some of that information isn't the best, but nonetheless, at least it is getting information in front of people that they can filter out one way or the other. All right, con arguments. Well, generally speaking, okay, democracy is based, as we said, on the idea that people rule. In order for them to rule effectively, right, they have to make their own choices and they have to make quality decisions. If there's poor information or deliberate misinformation, right, in social media that they're using to make these decisions, then that's arguably undermining democracy, right, rather than protecting it. Now, let's look at some particular arguments. Truth, right? And I'm pulling these from the values, right? So now I'm kind of saying, and you might want to go back and kind of do this. You should go back and do this for the pro, but I kind of kept that more general. Now I'm saying, okay, let's look at some of these core democratic values that were on the other slides and think about how social media is going to impact these, right? The first is there can be massive disinformation, right? There's a lot of fake news, literally fake news that people just make up, right? So this especially happened during the last two presidential election cycles. People made up news sites that they just literally made up the stories. Then they kind of promoted those stories to people with, in most cases, honestly, conservative viewpoints, because they found that they were the most gullible to the fake information. Got people to click on the articles and made tons of money. So one of the famous examples is that there was a story produced in the 2016 election that says that Hillary Clinton was running a child sex trafficking ring out of a pizza shop in Washington, D.C. Now, whatever you think of Hillary Clinton, I mean, this is absurd, right? And then she was doing this in the middle of her campaign, right? It's kind of absolutely ridiculous. But a number of these fake media news sites started publishing this story, right? And then people saw it in more than one place. People don't really realize what a even quasi-legitimate news source is. And people really started believing this. One guy believed it so much that he drove, I think it was from Florida, all the way to Washington, D.C., entered this pizza shop where she was supposedly running this child sex trafficking ring out of the back of the pizza shop, came in with a gun, did save the children who were supposedly being trafficked by some operation that Hillary Clinton was running. I mean, this is just completely fabricated news. And we can debate a lot about news. Oh, is this accurate? How are statistics spawned? Does it have a bias? Those are all worthy debates to have. But we now see with social media, right, being promoted that these fake news sites, which would not be social media sites in and of themselves, right? They're not user-produced news that's pushed in front of you, but the users are sharing this information. We have blatantly fake news sites that people are running just to make money that are targeted at users. And there's massive disinformation, right? So, look, I mean, the election was close. These types of arguments and sites, probably swayed the elections, right? In some states, I think she lost by Michigan or Wisconsin by 10,000 votes. Not that many votes. So fake news probably at least impacted somewhat the presidential election. Probably wasn't responsible for the outcome, but it definitely had an impact. You could say that social media undermines the common good. How? Well, it's polarizing. There's an idea of echo chambers that you need to be familiar with. Look, I mean, I'll be honest, most of my friends on Facebook are liberal. Okay, I have a few conservative friends, and like kind of, their friends will post in there or whatever, but we are largely friends on social media with people who share our own political outlooks. And then, we post stuff that everybody kind of agrees with. Yes, like that. I agree with that, right? And then other people, our few friends that we have on the other side, right, post things, you kind of mostly ignore it. Sometimes you make a comment, right? But if you were just to judge, who is going to win the presidential election by my own Facebook feed, I would say that, Hillary Clinton or Joe Biden would have won like 90 or 95% of the votes, right? But it's, part of it's like I'm just kind of in this echo chamber, right? And then you do have kind of more extremism in society, which, if society becomes polarized, then governments start to assert more control. You can say there's a lack of justice because there's no truth, right? People aren't being treated fairly. It can be bad for people. A lot of people are posting anonymously, or you have bots. That anonymity is not, I guess maybe privacy, not really like part of a democratic value. It's not going to kind of strengthen the democracy, make everything better, right? If people are just posting anonymous, like random opinions that may not necessarily be true, right? Again, the bots themselves could undermine the democratic process. They're not people, right? Imagine you have your old-fashioned public square where like people are participating and arguing, and some robots show up and like throw in some arguments, right? And try to adjust things or try to overwhelm the actual people who are participating, right? Just pushing so many views, right, into that public sphere. It's kind of, at the very least, to think about it conceptually, it's kind of the opposite of the ideal speech situation. It could definitely undermine social media. Definitely can threaten equality. You could allow like-minded racist groups to collaborate. As I mentioned, even on the pro side, social media can allow different people with different views, right, across a wide geographic space to kind of like collaborate. There's a book by Putnam called Bowling Alone, which is about like social capital in America. The book was written in 2000. But in that time, all right, Putnam speculates that the internet is going to potentially allow these like small pockets, these small racist groups in all different parts of America to like kind of connect with each other and like form like a larger movement. That's clearly happening in America right now, right? So that could be a downside of that. They could implement regressive social policies, unequal economic policies, promote liberal policies, more white nationalism, more Trump type style like of a politics. It could increase hate speech. People just say outrageous, offensive things on social media. That hate speech itself, right? There's a lot of racism on social media that can obviously threaten equality. Now, you can also look and say social media, and this goes back to the idea of like, well, do the companies count, right? All right, do the companies count as social media, or are they distinct? They have excluded, not a lot. There's not a lot of exclusion. You have to do something really, really bad, especially to be excluded for a long period of time. But look, they blocked one of the biggest political figures, right, in America right now, Trump, right? Whether you like him or dislike him, he has a huge impact on politics. He's been banned from Twitter and Facebook, right? So you could say, well, it's kind of, it's anti-democratic to exclude a voice. Now the question becomes, at what point is it okay to exclude a voice if he's promoting violence, domestic violence, right, racism? Then it's arguably okay to exclude a voice. But here's again, it's an example of where we see democratic values in conflict, right? The idea that everyone should be able to participate equally, the best ideas should like rise to the top. It's like, well, no, but that's inconsistent with like equality. Like these two values, right, are coming in conflict. This idea of like, it's more an idea, not constitutional, because the Constitution only restricts the government or prevents the government from restricting speech, not kind of private companies. But in terms of ideals, right, or values, right, the idea of kind of self-expression has come into conflict with equality. and peace and like social cohesion, right? So the judges in this case, right, have, the people who kind of run these platforms have decided that like Trump should not be on them. That like this value, that the value of like promoting equality and social cohesion outweighs kind of his the value of him like expressing himself. But there's definitely a debate there, and this is something I'm sure political conservatives, if you're a politically conservative judge, this is something they're not going to be happy with, that he's excluded. So can make an appeal there. Obviously, there can be some manipulation. Information is pushed at voters essentially in a way that kind of manipulates them, right? It's like takes my personal values, my belief about X, and then kind of creates an ad around it. People can be politically harassed for their views. Online, right? Say, I post something of view, I might get attacked for it. That harassment could actually discourage participation, or at least discourage quality participation, and can result in unequal participation. Women, for example, right, do not want to participate in hostile forums. Like people generally don't want to participate in hostile forums, but women themselves could be targeted in these forums. Women are often sexually harassed in these types of forums. It can be difficult for women to participate in these types of forums online, and then certain minorities, they can be targeted as well. Social media can be used also to promote government surveillance and surveillance of people, right? They're kind of tracking like everything you do, places you go, things you think, right? And then they're using that to kind of, like I say, kind of manipulate your opinion. But it is collecting a lot of information on different users, especially their beliefs, right? We want the government to know everything that we think. It can promote conspiracy theories, as you know, like, QAnon is an example from the last election, right? Promoted this idea that there was kind of this secret cabal of of like leaders who were promoting like sex trafficking, underground sex trafficking, and these were like Democrats. And you can read about the Q conspiracy. It's pretty far out there, right? But these can kind of foster online. Like you're not going to find a major media organization promoting a conspiracy theory. But you are going to find this on social media. And of course, we have foreign election interference made possible by social media, right? We have foreign governments kind of essentially advertising, supporting particular candidates on social media, because there really isn't regulation of political advertising on social media the way there is on networks, right? So the Russian government, right, or it's or some fake setup company, it'd be pretty hard for them to get around all the laws to purchase advertising like on CNN, right, or on ABC. But in social media, yeah, that stuff's hard to control. Anyone can set anything up, an account, purchase some ads, target some users. If you've ever done any social media advertising, you can see it's kind of it's an easy thing to do, and and then of course, like I say, on top of that, there weren't any regulations that govern it. Now, I think the other thing is that one note on con on the meta is what you kind of want to argue is that like these potential gains, right, to social media, the idea that people are going to get on the internet, social media, and they're going to post, and we're going to have this flourishing exchange of ideas and like democracy. It's kind of it was a dream. It was something that was supposed to happen, right? Like we saw the Arab Spring, we saw all these kind of things, but in practice, and maybe even did happen in the Arab Spring, but that was a long time ago. All right. In practice, like what's happened is that governments, right, and large corporations are able to kind of effectively control that space, right? Like they have the capital, they have the resources, they have the influence, right, to like kind of essentially buy ads in the space, to buy promotions in the space, to really push their own points of view in the space, to kind of manipulate the space, to manipulate the users. And that's kind of overwhelmed any kind of sense of like personal empowerment, right, that you're going to get, and that the overall effect, therefore, is negative. And there's a really good Vox article, if you go back and you click on the presentation, that originally kind of explains all this. Now, as we get to the end, a few things to think about. Again, the arguments are appealing to the impact of social media on democracy itself or democratic values. Like, which is it appealing to? what is the resolution really about? Is it really about democracy? It's about democratic values, or I guess is it kind of about both, right? It's probably going to get debated a little bit about both with an emphasis on one or the other. I think the emphasis is more on the values, and that the values are kind of beyond democracy, right? We can say equality is good even if we don't have a democracy, right? So they're kind of intertwined together, but the democratic values piece is a lot larger. Which democratic values are the most important? That's something you're going to have to resolve in like your framework debates. I also think winning on the pro is really going to be hard. If you just research this topic, most of the evidence is pretty con. Like it mostly says that social media is like not a good thing. At least in terms of democratic values. I mean, social media might be good, and then you get to like see your friends and get pictures of your family who live in other parts of the country. There's definitely a lot of value to social media there, but in terms of its impact on democratic values, it's probably it's going to be a bit of a stretch to win on the pro. You're really going to have to say like this value of like maybe free expression or like liberty, right? Of just making some kind of a contribution, like getting your voice out there is like super important, because it's definitely not good for like, I would say definitely, I'll say that I'll caution, I'll condition it a little bit. It's probably not really good for equality. It's probably not the best form of participation. It's probably discriminatory. It is difficult for women and other minorities to participate in these forums. It does kind of create an echo chamber, and it's polarizing society, which is creating divisiveness. Like these latter arguments are probably true. So I think it's going to be a little bit tough for the pro. In terms of discussion questions, a few things you might want to think about, right? What information and what kind of information would you need to make a good choice, right? Like say, okay, what level of education do I need? What information do I need to make a good choice about like a candidate, to make a good choice about a policy, and how does kind of social media affect my ability to do that? The second thing is how will you articulate the difference between democracy and democratic values? Or if you want to articulate, how those things are going to tie together, how are you going to do that? And then what are the most important democratic values to you and why? Because I think in the summary and the final focus, you're really going to need to be able to like express that. Like, why are these values like so important? With that, I'll kind of end the lecture.